tonight's speaker. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself.
Ginya, go ahead.
Okay, it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Maynard Goldman. And as you all read in the newsletter, Maynard graduated from the University of Michigan with a BA in political science and also the Harvard Law School. And in addition to that, he has done a lot with politics. And I thought you'd like to know what his experiences have been. They range from projects for Gerald Ford as a congressman, for Joe Martin as the Speaker of the House, and Ed Brooks, who was the senator from Massachusetts, also worked with Michael Dukakis, Ted Kennedy, and Speaker Tip O'Neill. So if there's anybody who knows a lot about politics and politicians, it is Maynard. But I didn't want you to think that is all he is. He is also a very successful OSHER speaker, kind of a Renaissance man who goes from one topic to another, always of interest. For example, Marilyn Monroe was what he talked about one year. Summer of 1941, the Supreme Court. And the last one, I think he will be doing this spring, has to do with Saul Hurok, etc. So it is, oh, and I want to also ask Sean if he would explain about our format for questions and answers, and then we'll have Maynard come on screen. Sean?
Yes, thank you, Ginya. So tonight we'll be having our Q&A session after the presentation. And what we'll ask is that everybody attending, please use in the participants panel, which you can access via a button at the bottom of your Zoom window. In that interface at the bottom of the participants panel, there will be an icon you can press to raise your hand. And at the end of the presentation, we'll ask the people who have questions to submit. Please raise your hand using that interface, and we will call on you one by one to have you present your question at that time.
Thank you, Sean. So now, Maynard, I hope you're there.
I'm here.
Wonderful. Carry on.
Well, thank you very much, Ginya, for asking me to join the illustrious group of speakers that you've had this year, and I know on a continuing basis. I'm very pleased to be here, and I know that there are some people from our OSHER class, which we just finished, and so I'm hopeful that I'll be able to pique the interest of those who are here. My wife says that nobody can clear a room as quickly as I do, but my response to that is, well, if you're going to offend some people, you might as well offend everybody. So my purpose tonight is not to offend, but to challenge you a little on some matters that I think are of great current interest, as well as long-term interest. So I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions afterwards. I can tell you ahead of time, one of the things about being involved in politics, and it's particularly in a classroom situation, is that there are no right answers. So I have lots of questions and only a few answers, but I will do my best to respond to comments which you have. Winston Churchill, who was one of my favorite historical characters, said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others." And I think, frankly, there's a lot to that particular quote. The topic tonight is the lame duck. Can it swim? We'll come to that. But I wanted to start just by trying to set the stage a little. I don't have slides tonight because I'm not using a lot of numbers. And I thought that some of you might have a little adult beverage handy as we move through this process. which I think is sometimes helpful in these matters. But I do think that you may want to make a note or two if you do have a thought as we go forward. So the latest numbers that I saw this morning showed that President-elect Biden had over 79 million votes, and they're still counting in California and New York and Illinois and a number of other states. I think there's a very good chance he's going to get 80 million votes, which is a huge increase over what Hillary Clinton got in 2016 when she had roughly 65 million votes. Of course, the other point is that President Trump at last count had 73 million votes, a very substantial, almost a 10 million vote increase over what he had 4 years ago. So I think one of the questions that we can ask ourselves is, how is it that we had such an increase really on both sides of the equation? Obviously, we had a huge turnout. It was probably the biggest percentage turnout in maybe 100 years. And of course, in terms of total numbers, it's far and away the largest turnout in our history. And yet, it's probably only 65 or 67% of the eligible voting population. Interestingly enough, each candidate won 25 states. And Joe obviously won the District of Columbia. The electoral vote appears to be 306 to 232, which is an exact reversal of what it was in 2016 when Trump won 306 to 232, although actually, technically, his total was 304, not 306, because there were 2 electoral voters who chose not to vote for Trump. And so his final total turned out to be 304. So there are 3 questions I want to ask now, and we'll come back to them later, but they're indicative of the kinds of discussion and the kinds of matters I want to raise with you. 1, why do we vote on a Tuesday? 2, why do we vote in November? 3, why do we wait until January 20th to have the inauguration? So in the US Senate races, again, just to continue this effort to kind of set the stage, we went into the Senate races with the Republicans leading 53 to 47. As we sit here tonight, we have 50 to 48, which I know you know, there are 2 races that we're going to have on January 5th in the state of Georgia, which will determine how the Senate winds up. And I want to talk about Georgia in more detail later in the discussion. I think an interesting fact is that the Democrats spent hundreds of millions of dollars in major races in key states: Kentucky, South Carolina, North Carolina, Maine, Iowa, and came up short. Of course, they did win in Arizona and Colorado. They lost a race they knew they were going to lose in Alabama. But the long and the short of it is that the decision is going to be made in Georgia. In the US House, where the Democrats thought that they were going to, I think, win 10 to 15 seats, they again not only fell short of winning 10 to 15 seats, but they likely are going to lose 10 to 12 seats. A huge swing, and this will probably be the smallest majority for a new president in the House since World War II. In state houses around the country, the Republicans did an excellent job, much to the Democrats' dismay. And I believe it's correct to say that only in New Hampshire did the legislature actually swing both houses for either party. And of course, here they swung to the Republicans. So it's an interesting question here in New Hampshire. The Democrats won the race for president. They won the Senate race with Jeanne Shaheen. They won both House races, and yet with the governor, who of course is a Republican, they lost both the Senate, the state Senate, the state House, and the executive council. Query: why did that happen? What kind of a split does that suggest here in New Hampshire? And I think the Democrats are going to have to be asking themselves that question very seriously. In terms of governors, the Democrats lost one governor. So the current status of governors in the country, 27 Republicans and 23 Democrats. Just a few other numbers related not to the election itself, but to the virus, because I think that's so important to where we are today. This morning, I think I saw 167,000 new cases in a single day in this country. 11 million total cases. We're going to reach 250,000 dead in the next couple of days, and the prospects over the winter are not good. Of course, we don't know the impact of the vaccines that people are talking about. I, for one, I certainly am no expert in vaccines, but it seems to me that the likelihood of significant distribution quickly is pretty remote. But that, of course, will be important and interesting to watch. Another footnote, President Trump will be the first president to lose 2 popular votes since Benjamin Harrison. I'll bet that's a name you remember. In 1888 and 1892, when he lost 2 popular vote elections to Grover Cleveland, but won one of those elections in the Electoral College and lost the other. So moving on, in these electoral contests, there are a number of dates that are very important that I wanted just quickly to run over with you. December 8th, in 3 weeks, there's a deadline for resolving any disputes in the Electoral College counts, in the popular vote counts in any of the states. So all court actions, etc., need to be resolved by that date. December 14th is when the Electoral College meets. That is to say, they meet in separate states. There are 50 different meetings. They never meet together. On December 23rd or by December 23rd, they're supposed to submit the certifications to a variety of people who receive them: the National Archivist in Washington, a federal district judge in the state in which they sit. And then on January 3rd, the new Congress will reconvene or convene. And then on January 6th, the new Congress will meet at 1 p.m. to count the votes. And in 63 days, I think that's correct, the inauguration will be held. I want to make a comment that I think may surprise some of you, maybe not. Many of us grew up at a time when civics classes were still given in junior high and high schools. I don't think they give civics classes in many places anymore, although I note that the president has expressed some interest in a patriotic education, whatever that may be. But I don't think we can confuse Betsy DeVos with Betsy Ross. So in any event, what I wanted to say and to point out to you comes from the Supreme Court decision in Bush v. Gore in 2020. And the quote is, the individual citizen has no, underline no, federal constitutional right to vote for electors for president. I want to repeat that. The individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote for electors for president. Our great founders who founded this democracy had no interest in a popular vote. Obviously, women couldn't vote. The Native Americans couldn't vote. The slaves couldn't vote. Most Jews and Catholics couldn't vote. Less than 10% of the population, the white, American, Saxon, Protestant, landed gentry people, they were the only voters. And so over a period of time, obviously that has changed. We've seen amendments to the Constitution to that effect, but we still have clearly in this country voter suppression in an unimaginable way. So what's happened over the years is that the states have controlled the voting policies and procedures, because that's what basically the constitutional founders wanted to happen. We have 50 states. We have over 3,000 counties, 13,000 voting districts. Almost every one of those elections is decided by a popular vote, i.e., the guy or gal who gets the most votes wins the election. That's true, except for one vote, and that is the vote for president. I leave you with the question, what kind of sense does that make? There's no other country in the world who has anything like that. And there's no other country in the world that has ever actually had anything like that. So for a moment, let's talk a little bit more about the founders, because one of the institutions that gets involved in these things, obviously, is the court, mostly the Supreme Court, but in some cases, of course, there are state courts that get involved. And I know that all of you are familiar with the term originalism, which in recent years has been very popular in discussing the Supreme Court in particular. And of course, Justice Scalia, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, and perhaps one or more of the more recent appointees, we're not sure yet, would consider themselves originalists. So Justice Scalia, who grew up in Queens, struck down on several occasions the ACA. He voted against greenhouse gas regulations. He voted against gun control laws. He voted against affirmative action. He voted against campaign finance regulation. He voted against LGBTQ rights. He voted against same-sex marriage. He voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, and that's just off the top of my head. So that's where that side of the party politics is playing. Justice Roberts, of course, is fond of saying that all the court does is calls, balls, and strikes. But I suggest to you that it really is a lot more than that. In Congress, we have 535 congressmen, including senators, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate, as you know. And yet we have one man, the majority leader of the Senate, who controls legislation. He represents 4 million people in the state of Kentucky, 87% white, and he alone determines whether the Senate will listen and take up any legislation that is passed by the House. I ask you, is that a reasonable situation in our democracy? So moving on, I think that the lame duck session, all of you know, is the period of time between the election itself and the time when the inauguration takes place. That period today is 77 days. 77 days, 11 weeks. Why? Well, it's complicated, but it's not complicated. Basically, in 1932, the Congress passed the 20th Amendment, which changed some of the dates that I had previously referred to. Prior to that, the inauguration was actually later. It was in March when the election was in November. So it was almost 6 months between the date of the election and the date of the inauguration. Why is that? No other country in the world does that. Even in parliamentary governments, when there's a vote of no confidence, the prime minister is out on his fanny that day. Gone, goodbye, see you later. History. But we wait this inordinate amount of time. Well, if we go back to the founding fathers again, back in the late 1700s, there probably was some reason for this calendar delay. Of course, in those days, transportation and communication were very different. People traveled by horseback, and there were no cell phones, telegraphs, et cetera, et cetera. So it took some time to go between New York and Washington or Boston or Philadelphia or wherever. And so there were reasons why it was necessary, perhaps, to have some delay. But over a period of time, this has all changed. One change came, of course, as I mentioned, in 1932. But there are a couple examples of things that have happened during the lame duck that I thought I would bring to your attention. During the Civil War, actually just before the Civil War, Lincoln was elected in November. South Carolina seceded from the Union in January. And by the time Lincoln took office in March, all of the other states that were going to succeed had seceded. And the Civil War was basically going. FDR was elected in November in 1932, and President Hoover wanted desperately for FDR to meet with him and talk about plans for taking action. And FDR refused to meet with him. And so he waited until March 3rd or 4th, whatever the date was, before he began to implement plans. Well, in the meantime, thousands of banks in the United States went out of business, went bankrupt. People, as you all know, because we've all seen pictures of the long lines and all of the heartache, economic heartache, that people had during that time. So those are just 2 examples of things that happened during the lame duck. And here we are today talking about or thinking about a lame duck. So I asked the question earlier, why do we vote on Tuesday? Well, the real reason we vote on Tuesdays is that back in the early 1800s, when they were kicking this around, most of the people who were voters were farmers. Yes, there were some people who were merchants and tradesmen, but most of the voters were farmers. And so they thought they had to find a day that would be easiest for the farmers to come and vote. Well, it turns out that it took a day or 2 to go from place to place to get to the polls where they were going to vote. And so they eliminated the weekends, they eliminated them. Anyway, it wound up to be a Tuesday. Why November? Well, it was November because they were farmers. They were planting in the spring and they were harvesting in the fall. So November was kind of a middle time that they came up with. Well, that was 200 years ago. This country has changed. There's no good reason why we should be voting on a Tuesday or in November. Now, I'm not here tonight to tell you that we should come up with a day, but what I'm here to say is this has been going on for 200 years because nobody's bothered to pay attention to it. But it doesn't make much sense all by itself, and it particularly doesn't make much sense if the inauguration is 77 days later. Look at all the damage that could be done in this 77-day period. So I'd like to move to that. I think that, the president-elect is going to need to appoint over 4,000 political appointees. 1,250 of them are going to require Senate confirmation. He's going to have to prepare almost a $5 trillion budget. He's going to have to assume leadership of 2 million civilian employees and another 2 million active duty and reservists in the military. That doesn't even begin to take into account the virus, which between now and this January 20th could be just numbers that are almost unimaginable now. Almost unimaginable. Hundreds of thousands of people a day, possibly. Probably. Because the way things are going, we don't seem to be able to have a handle on this. And there are 70 million plus people, or certainly a huge number, that don't want to wear a mask, that don't want to socially distance, many of whom don't even believe there is a virus. So the president-elect is going into this with one hand tied behind his back. What are some of the other things that he's going to have to do during this period? Well, we know now there are recounts going on. Actually, this situation in Georgia, you may or may not know, is not technically a recount. It's what they call an audit. And there is a difference between an audit and a recount. the state of Georgia this year was required by law, its own law, to have an audit. And they left it up to the Secretary of State to decide which race he would audit. And the race he chose was the race for president. So technically in an audit, you don't have to actually count every vote. But because of the closeness of this race and the importance of it, he decided that they would count every vote. And so they're now in the process of counting every vote. What you may or may not know is that regardless of the outcome of that audit, because of the closeness of the race, the president can call for a recount. So when this audit is over, I think it's very likely that President Trump is going to call for a recount. And they're going to count those ballots all over again. In Wisconsin, the president has asked for a recount. The cost to the people of the state, well, the cost is about $7.8 million. And under the laws of the state of Wisconsin, the person who calls for the recount is supposed to pay for it. Well, President Trump's history of paying for things is not at the top of everybody's list. So if I were the governor of Wisconsin, I certainly would be pretty clear with the president that there ain't going to be no recount until I have a check, because afterwards, I'm not going to see any money, that's for sure. So that's the story currently on recounts. We may see more of them, but remember the dates I gave you earlier, that these things need to be complete. What else is going to happen during this lame duck period? President Trump going to conduct rallies? Is he going to go out on Air Force One and do rallies the way he did before the election? He said he would, but we've not seen any indication of this. If he does, are we going to listen to the dog whistles? Is he going to be out there inciting riots, telling the Proud Boys to stand by? I think that's a real possibility. That's probably the most dangerous possibility. And if so, if that happens, what can anybody do about it? And the answer, frankly, is not a lot. Governors can call out the National Guard in their states, but under the Insurrection Act, the president has authority to call out the militia, which may or may not be the National Guard, and he could probably, if it came to that, overrule the state governor and take charge of those National Guards or individual guards. He's already fired the head of the Defense Department, and there are rumors that he's going to fire the head of the FBI and the CIA. I have no idea whether those rumors are true. We heard today some more rumors that he was asking his aides about options as to how he could attack Iran. Again, I have no way of knowing whether any of that is true. He's going to draw down on troops, apparently, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And from everything I've read, all of the military experts, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and everybody else, has advised him against this, because those troops today are holding together whatever peace talks are going on. And should they leave, or a substantial portion of them leave, it's possible that that will all implode and we'll be back exactly where we started 20 years ago. Is he going to permit any high-level transition with President-elect Biden? It doesn't look that way. And as I say, and I think I said earlier, this is going to hamstring the Biden administration. It's not the end of the world, but what this means is that when the Biden administration, I read today that I think he appointed 6 or 7 staff people in the White House. Well, they can't even get started on security checks unless this transition begins and they have the opportunity to submit the material. Because if there's nobody to submit the material to, then they can't submit it. Which means that if they can't submit it until January 20th, then there'll be a 3 or 4 or 5 week period where nobody will be able to do anything because they haven't had their security clearance. I also saw today that the administration is moving to hurry up with leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, which has been a highly controversial decision that the administration made to open up oil drilling in this wildlife refuge. And they want to do it now before they want to assign the leases with oil companies who may want to start drilling there. So that's something else that we can expect to see. And not finally, but what about the pardons that we're going to see during this period of time? You know, President Clinton probably, certainly in recent times, I think he pardoned 145 people, some number like that, in the last 2 days of office, including a half-brother and a bunch of other people. It was truly one of the most distasteful series of events in recent political times. There were people who never should have been pardoned. There were a number of people who were pardoned who committed crimes unrelated afterwards and went back to jail. But this does not, I have no idea what the president is going to do, but I suspect we're going to see a raft of pardons. And one, I think, of the most interesting things is he going to pardon himself? You know, this has been a constitutional issue for years among constitutional scholars. Most scholars think you can't pardon yourself. But Mr. Trump has proven time and time again that you never know what you can do until you try. So I think we have that to concern ourselves with. And there are dozens of other things that need to be done during this period of time. On December 11th, the current funding runs out for the federal government. What's going to happen? Is there going to be a CRO, a continuing resolution? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think President Trump cares whether the government shuts down or not. But other people care. And so my best guess is they'll probably come to some kind of a resolution and kick the can down the road for 60 days so that Joe will have to worry about it in February. So again, that's just one more point. There are a whole series of COVID-related issues, which I know you've read about, going back to the prior legislation. And Congress, the House, has passed a number of these bills, which are sitting on McConnell's desk. I have no way of knowing.
Yeah. Great.
What are they talking about?
I'm sorry. Anyway, whole series of these issues. And so I think that we're living in a time, we've got a cacophony of dunces in Washington at this point. We've got people who have no clue what they're doing. And we need some competence. We need the chaos to end. We need somebody to pick up the safety net, which is disappearing as we speak. We have all kinds of tax regulations which are expiring at the end of the year, many of which need to be addressed. Finally, I'd like just to spend a couple of minutes with you on the Georgia election. You know that there are 2 seats up, one with David Perdue, who is an elected senator, and one with Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed to a position after Johnny Isakson resigned. Kelly Loeffler is the wife of a man named Jeffrey Sprecher, who is the chairman of the board of a company called ICE, which is a publicly held company, which owns, among other things, owns the New York Stock Exchange. According to records filed, Kelly, is the richest senator. And you may remember that she was charged with insider trading, and the Senate Ethics Committee has absolved her. Mr. Sprecher also bought her a present a couple of years ago, the Atlanta Dream, which is the WNBA women's basketball team. So she's perfectly positioned to be a great representative for the people in the state of Georgia. Mr. Perdue was a successful businessman. He was in a business not unlike Mitt Romney. He didn't work for Bain the way Romney did, but he did work for a number of companies who were basically took over bankrupt companies and attempted to revive them and sell them. He was successful in a number of those efforts. He was unsuccessful in a number of those efforts and laid off tens of thousands of people during that time. It's interesting to me that where Romney took it, really in the head from the start because of his participation in Bain, that Mr. Perdue has had literally kind of no pushback, as best I know, on this. And of course, there are challenges. John Ossoff, who ran in 2017 for what at that time was the most expensive House race in America, and lost that election. And then just recently, of course, lost this election to Perdue. But the thing that he lost the plurality, but there was a third party candidate who had a small number of votes that he took, it was a libertarian, took away from Perdue and dropped Perdue below the 50% level. And in Georgia, if you don't get 50%, you have to run in a runoff. The other election is Raphael Warnock, a minister in the Ebenezer Baptist Church, who will be running against Kelly Loeffler, because Loeffler and Doug Collins, who was a Republican rep, split the Republican vote. So 2 seats are up. There's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars poured into those races. The history of runoffs in Georgia is not positive for Democrats. The most recent one was in 2008, where Saxby Chambliss, who was at that time senator, had won actually hadn't won, but he led in the regular election by 3 points, and in the runoff, he won by 15 points, mostly because the Democrats, I think, just didn't show up. And the history of runoffs usually is that the number of votes drop off. Now, this election is in 50 days 5-0. There isn't much time here. Ossoff challenged Perdue to debates. Perdue has said he's not going to debate. There's going to be, I think, no shortage of money. The Republicans have already used a few words. They've used defund the police. They've used socialism. And they're going to hang that around the necks of the Democrats. The Democrats need to have a message. They need to come back with the cancellation of Medicaid in Georgia, which President Trump and the governor of Georgia orchestrated. They're going to take hundreds of thousands of people off of Medicaid and Medicare. And I don't know how successful they're going to be in doing that. Is President Trump going to go to Georgia to campaign? Is President-elect Biden going to go to Georgia to campaign? Is Kamala Harris going to go to Georgia to campaign? I don't know the answer to those questions, but I think they're interesting and important questions. So I think I want to give you time to ask some questions and make some comments. I have to say that I'm not optimistic for the Democrats in these special elections. And I'm not optimistic despite the fact that Kelly Abrams and her staff of unbelievable, mostly African-American women did an incredible job of registering people down there and turned the state blue, at least on a quote unquote national level. I think it's going to be very difficult, a real uphill race to make it happen. Mr. Ossoff is Jewish. My research shows that there's only been one statewide Jewish person elected in the state of Georgia in its history. That was a man who was elected back some 20 years ago to 2 terms as Attorney General. And I believe there's only been one Black person elected to a statewide post in Georgia's history, at least since Reconstruction. And he was a Supreme Court justice, and that was a long time ago. Georgia, you may or may not remember, was the second, was a state that had the second largest number of lynchings many years ago. But outside of Atlanta and the metropolitan area, this state remains a hotbed of serious racial issues. And I think this is going to be one very tough race. So I'd like to close by simply saying that this country needs desperately to find a way to come together. We are not enemies, should not be enemies. We need to be opponents, but we need to be able to sit down and talk to one another and not at one another. We need to be able to talk about these issues not as party loyalists, but as Americans. And I'm very concerned based on what I have seen in the last number of years. It didn't start with President Trump, but it certainly has intensified. And the Republican Party has become the Trump Party. What if Donald Trump, another question which I haven't addressed, what is Donald Trump going to do once he leaves the White House? Well, I don't know any more than anybody else, but I suspect that he will hold the Republican Party hostage. He will say that he is going to run for president in 2024, and there isn't a single, not one Republican senator who will stand up and say anything about it. Vice President Pence, the Lord of the Flies, certainly will have nothing to say, and will not do anything, hoping perhaps maybe to run for vice president again in 2024. I have no idea. But whether he goes into the media business, I think one thing is for sure. We're going to see a continuing barrage of tweets every single solitary day. And the Trump administration, the Biden administration is going to have to find a way to exist, to live, to manage, to move forward, ignoring those. And the media is going to play a very important role in all of this. So I thank you very much for your time, and I will be very happy to take any questions you have or comments. Senior, whatever.
I'll start. I've raised my hand. I'm inclined to think that Donald Trump will not cooperate with the transition in any way. He won't even show up at the inauguration. He will not greet the Bidens at the White House prior to the inauguration. Has that ever happened before in our history?
So it's happened 3 times. It happened with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It happened with John Quincy Adams. And I forget for a moment, it didn't come to me. And it happened with Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant. So it's happened 3 times. And, you know, this is not, again, this is not quote unquote the end of the world. It's just in today's situation, it's a tasteless and classless response to something that, you know, in my view at least, is a continuation of what we've seen since he first walked down the escalator in Trump Tower.
Can I follow one more question?
Sure.
Do you think his legal liability with the Attorney General of New York and the District Attorney of Manhattan is going to limit his ability to influence the Republican Party?
So, you know, I think that that's a very interesting question. And I think it has kind of 2 pieces. He certainly is going to get a pardon one way or the other. I mean, if he pardons himself, he's going to spend a lot of time, he may spend a lot of time fighting it in court. We know he can't pardon himself for state crimes. And I think that there's going to be a very interesting question for the new Democratic administration. How much time, if any, do we want to spend chasing Donald Trump? And how much political capital are we going to lose or gain? Now, the states, of course, can make these decisions by themselves. The Attorney General of the state of New York or the state of Virginia or any place else doesn't need the approval or support of the White House to bring action. And we know there are some cases pending. There are some motions pending by the president now in the Supreme Court for his tax returns, you know, so I think the court is waiting until after the 20th so they can basically throw this out the door because they really don't want to deal with it. But how much time he will spend defending cases is an interesting question. There are, I think, 24 cases of women who are chasing him. And I think there are a number of questions about these cases. Let's assume for a moment, but I don't know. Let's assume for a moment that some of these cases can be demonstrated. So if they get judgments against Mr. Trump, will he be judgment proof? Will he declare bankruptcy? I don't think he has any money. He has assets, but he's got a huge amount of debt. So, you know, if you put those golf courses on the market tomorrow, who's going to buy them? The answer is nobody. Not for any price. Nobody wants those properties. So I think that, you know, if he goes into the media business, he's going to have to make a deal with somebody to put up whatever the amount of money is, because he doesn't have. So I think that the question you ask is an interesting one. I think some of the civil cases will continue, but I think some of them may fade away simply because nobody will want to, quote unquote, waste their time.
I've got a question about what you think about the extended voting time. I don't mean mail-in ballots, but the voting early as opposed to people voting on the first Tuesday of November.
Well, I think that, frankly, I think extended voting time is, first of all, it's not a new thing. Many states have had extended voting times prior to this, and I'm sure you're aware that many states, particularly on the West Coast, have had all mail-in ballots for a number of years. My guess is that many states will now go to extended voting times, and that I think that makes a lot of sense. Why should people, regardless of the virus, why should people have to, you know, stand in line or vote, you know, within a particular number of hours or whatever it is? You know, in many places, voting is done. You know, you stick your card into an electronic device, and you get an instant response from wherever you're sending it to, saying, you know, John Smith has now voted in this election. You don't have to go anywhere. Sooner or later, we may see that when we feel, I guess, that security is sufficient to enable us to do that. One thing for sure is that it makes no sense for 50 different states to have 50 different systems. It is patently absurd on its face, and it makes no sense for the federal government not to run its own elections or to have its own rules as to how those federal elections should be run, rather than leaving them to the state.
Thank you.
Did I put everybody to sleep?
Okay, John, go ahead.
What?
Did you unmute yourself?
Oh, I tried to, I did. I don't know how to.
Maynard, if Trump becomes, I don't want to say irrelevant, but if he takes himself out of the running for 2024, either voluntarily or as a result of an accumulation of problems for him, do you believe the Republican Party will be a reflection of Trump in 2024, or will they look for a new direction?
Well, I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, if Trump were to die, then, you know, that would raise, I think, an interesting question. My take on the family relationships is that if he were to have to support one of his kids, he would support Ivanka over the boys. He doesn't have any use for the sons. So I think he would support her. But I think if he were still alive and for whatever reason, you know, didn't seem to have any more interest, moved to Saudi Arabia or some such place where he could get treated royally.
Russia.
Well, he can get treated better in Saudi Arabia than in Russia. But yes, I hear you. So I don't know. The Republican Party is bereft. And I don't know where they're going to go with those 70 million votes. And I don't see anybody at the moment on the horizon who appears to have the talent and the means and the skills to you know, to kind of pick that up. Of course, we might have all said that 4 years ago. So.
Anybody else have any questions for Maynard?
Well, I think that we have kept Maynard for a whole hour and we have learned so much. I'm so excited about whatever your next course is going to be politically, Maynard. I started out with the midterm elections, and now we've gone through this, and I can hardly wait for the next.
Well, in the spring, I'm going to do a class on the first 100 days of the Biden administration. So I think that'll be fun, and hopefully we'll be by and through all of this, some of these more unpleasant issues. I think the last message I would leave is that, and again, I'm trying to be optimistic as opposed to pessimistic. But you know, the Constitution is a wonderful document. You know, we had a wonderful show, Hamilton, which everybody paid a fortune to go see. And there was another very popular show, Why I Love the Constitution, that was popular on Broadway. But really, in truth, the Constitution needs help. And one of the things the founders did was make it very difficult to amend the Constitution. And given where we are in this country, the likelihood of amending it, calling a constitutional convention, which has never happened in this country's history since the original founders, looking at the way the two sides now see one another, I don't see even such a small thing, changing the date of the election. How hard could that be? Of course, you'd get people who would want every one of the 365 days and every one of the 12 months. But there are so many things that need to be reformed. The rules in Congress are ridiculous. We have a Supreme Court that has no ethics rules. They can recuse themselves whenever they want and don't have to recuse themselves at all. Justice Scalia once wrote a very famous 20-page opinion in which he refused to recuse himself in a case when his friend Dick Cheney was involved, and he voted with Cheney on the case. You know, they don't allow videotaping or anything of their cases. It's only since the virus came about that they've opted for audio. And one of the most interesting things to me is that Justice Thomas, who didn't say a word on the court for 12 years, and now you can't shut him up. It's like he's on the stage. So The court has its own problems. And we're living at a time when these institutions have been pulled and pushed. And one of the things that Trump has done is to push the envelope as far as he could. And what we've discovered is that this envelope is tearing and shredding. I'm not saying that it won't, that it will collapse. But one thing, for example, I can tell you that's happened is that Congress can no longer subpoena documents from the executive branch, because that's been wiped out in the last year and a half. They just say, we're not going to do it. Is that important? I think it's important. I think Congress should be able to get documents from the executive branch. So that's just one small example of the kind of, there are so many of these things. And I don't really know the best way to begin to resolve all of those things. So I think we have serious problems. I think our children and grandchildren are going to be facing some very interesting times. I wish you all.
Maynard, you've given us a number of fascinating topics for your next courses at OSHER. And we will look forward, all of us, to exploring them to come up with wonderful solutions, which of course you will help us to pursue.
Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Dartmouth Club of the Upper Valley and other guests, thank you so very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
So thank you for joining all of us, and those of us who are new, and those of us who are our old friends. And